Welcome to Speak of the Devils, the premier podcast for Sun Devil football. I'm Brad Denny with 3TV.
And I'm Joe Healey with DevilsDigest.com.
All right, Joe, we are kind of firmly in the football off season right now, and we've had some fun shows. Our last Untimed Down was a little fun draft of some of the all-time great Sun Devils. But one of the good things about the off season, one of the most frequently done things in the off season, is rankings. It's a good time to rank various things. So I think today it might be a good time to rank some budding rivalries in this new conference of ours.
As time has gone on, I've become less and less of a fan of like preseason rankings, but off-season rankings, which is what we'll be doing here today. Totally different deal. We're talking about some creativity that we're putting together, but it's an interesting thing because here we are. ASU is making its way through its second school year in the Big 12. So we're starting to see, and maybe can predict in the future to see, some of those new rivalries. Now, we all know that there's just that one right at the top, and nothing's going to take that place. But that doesn't mean that there can't be some matchups elsewhere across the conference that have some heat and some fire among them. Again, some have already started that way. Maybe some will become that way in the future. So we're going to break down kind of how we see things shaking out rivalry-wise in the Big 12 with ASU.
Yeah, after last season, ASU has now played all of their new conference mates. And so we do have some data points there for longtime listeners of the show. Not to head too much into spoiler country, but Utah is no longer my number two. So, I was pretty militant about my feelings on the ASU Utah rivalry over the years. But before we dive into all that, a couple of news items we should pass along, including talking about an old conference foe that's going to be popping back up on the schedule as ASU has scheduled a home and home football series with Stanford. In 2031, ASU will be heading up to Palo Alto, and with the return game in 2032. Now, this, of course, is coming in the midst of the SEC moving to a 9-game conference schedule. Of course, one of the caveats there with that schedule system is that each of them needs a Power 4 conference opponent as part of the non-con. ASU, just a couple of years ago, had 10 SEC opponents. Of course, they have got the full home and home with Mississippi State in the books. This upcoming fall, they'll be heading to Texas A&M. After that, we don't know exactly how that might shake out. Texas A&M, of course, on the books are to come here in 2027. But the future series with Florida was canceled back in September. LSU is still in question, and it looks like, by all intents and purposes, that the home and home with Texas will be canceled as well. And this Stanford series helps bridge that gap.
Yeah, it kind of saw the writing on the wall. Heck, we even talked about this sort of thing at our live show at 100 Mile Brewing in August, because I think that was right after the announcement of the increased games for the SEC conference schedule came about, and we talked about that, I believe, with Graham Rossini about this sort of thing could be coming down the chutes months down the road, and here exactly we are. Talking about that Texas A&M series, you got to get like Steve Patterson on the horn. I mean, that's the one thing that he did, was he kept that Notre Dame series, that Notre Dame return game in 2014 in play. So, that's something that got to make sure that sticks, but no reason, at least at this point, to fear that might not be on the schedule. It is unfortunate to see some of these future series falling apart, the likes of the Floridas and the Texases, and that ever elusive return game with LSU, which now is beyond 20 years in the making. Of course, that first game that ended up happening in Tempe in September of 2005. Those of us who have been following Sun Devil football, since that point, we've heard time and time again that return game was supposed to be on the schedule. It gets moved. A lot of theories and that sort of thing. So I think a lot of folks are thinking that just never is going to happen. It technically is on the schedule, but we'll see if that sticks. Just doesn't seem like it will be. Getting a team like Stanford back on the schedule, it's a cool thing. It's a familiar face. Now then, it does take away a little bit of that kind of mystique you see in some non-conference games where they're matchups that you've never seen before or haven't seen in a number of years, or you're playing, a marquee opponent that just is not very familiar to ASU. So it brings a kind of a little bit of an allure that way. Like when Mississippi State came into Tempe in 2024, that was kind of a cool thing to experience. So, getting a familiar face does take away from that sort of thing, but I think it is pretty cool to keep, some of the West Coast ties in there, some of the old Pac-10 and 12 ties in there as well. And, like I said, on Friday on our YouTube special, anytime you can get up to that rowdy, rocking game day atmosphere in Palo Alto, California, man, you get that wine and cheese in you, you might be clapping so hard that your hands might get a minor bruise or something like that. So just get ready for that sort of environment. But all joking aside, good that they're making headway on these sort of things. And, reading the tea leaves, there have been times in the past where, ASU was surprised by a non-conference opponent bailing out on the game and taking a higher payday elsewhere. That specifically happened in 2010 and is the reason that ASU didn't go to a bowl that year, even though they were 6-6. So taking away the full history lesson, what I'm saying here is it's good that ASU is getting ahead of this.
Absolutely. And so maybe that's another off-season episode we do. Maybe we like kind of put on our schedulers hats and try to make a dream non-con future slate, because of course ASU had games on the slate till 2033, and so we've seen kind of both extremes of these games that are scheduled so far into the future, and then we saw during the COVID season that you can get a good game during the week of, and I believe the Pac-12, I might be mistaken, but I did see that they're having some measure of flex scheduling in their upcoming TV deal, which actually I think might be pretty cool to get some more action there. So, it's kind of a real sad moment and a thing that you can't, no game in the swamp or heading to Austin, Texas, or seeing some of these cool locales, because that has been some of the coolest things of following this program around and seeing new places. But Graham Rossini, of course, has done a pretty good job. First with this schedule with Stanford, and he told me a couple summers ago that he maintaining those Pac-12 legacy ties is a real important thing for him, especially those LA schools. So I wouldn't necessarily be stunned to see a UCLA or USC home and home pop up on the future schedules as well. But it is kind of the era in which we're in with the expanded playoff era, and some teams that are moving away from those kind of big time marquee non-con games, and maybe knowing that they have a rigorous conference schedule of 9 games, that they want to get those 3 games to help pad that playoff resume. But it's kind of a shame. I think that we as the college football consumer base, maybe getting the short end of the stick when games like Arizona State and Texas just don't happen, because perhaps Texas wants to play some G6s or whatever before they dive into SEC play. So we will see exactly how things go on in the coming years, and maybe the Super League in 2030 or whatever, whenever that happens, might get rid of that. But anyway, that's just some things to mark your calendars for for 5 and 6 years down the road. Far more immediate, Joe. The Sun Devil baseball team is on fire.
Another week in the books, another handful of wins. So far, so good for ASU, to say the least. ASU 7 games in, 7 wins in. Now, I know that the immediate, clapback is going to be, well, they haven't really played anybody. Well, what I will say for that is there's a particular baseball team that's shown that it's maybe not so easy to defeat teams like UConn and Omaha and that sort of thing. But ASU again 7-0, and it's by design that it hasn't really ramped up too much, because as we enter this week, to quote the good old JR, business is about to pick up. All away from Phoenix Municipal Stadium, ASU has a 2-game set at a nationally ranked Oklahoma team, and then an absolutely massive weekend series in Arlington, Texas at Globe Life Field, where they will face a trio of highly ranked teams in Mississippi State, Tennessee, and Texas A&M. So ASU has 5 games coming up this week against 4 teams, all of which are in the top 25, many of which are in the top 15. Mississippi State is a top 5 team, I believe. So this is really going to, show what this team is made of. I'm not saying it's like make or break time this early in the season by any stretch, but things have been very encouraging so far. Not perfect baseball, but ASU is winning. One thing, just to put it all in a snapshot, as far as like the really succinct way to summarize how pleased I am right now with things. ASU as a team, batting average is 350. ASU as a team, ERA is 329. Their team batting average to be, higher than their team ERA. That is a work in progress. That's many years in the making. Again, very, very early, but we've seen this team just put together innings at the plate where they can just manufacture run after run after run. On Sunday, I believe they have multiple 5-run innings. We've seen this bullpen be able to come in and put the clamps on things. The starting pitching, especially Friday, Saturday. And you got to give Cole Klecker a shout out for his midweek performance earlier this past week. So far, so good. But we're going to know a heck of a lot more about this team pretty much this time next week. We're recording here Monday evening. By the time next Monday comes around, we'll learn a bit about things. So just a really intriguing time, and it doesn't really settle from there because ASU comes home, has a weekend series next weekend against Loyola Marymount, but after that, a midweek game at home against the U of A, and then a home series against TCU, which is unanimously was picked to be the Big 12 champion in the preseason. So some big baseball coming up ahead for ASU. Like I said, you got to be happy with where they are so far. And if they can keep some of this momentum going in these next couple of weeks, things could get pretty interesting around here.
Yeah, I've liked what I've seen so far. We knew that they were going to hit, even though there were a lot of new faces in that lineup, and of course, pitching was always a question. And you touch on it like that. This is kind of maybe the ease into the season before this grueling gauntlet of what, like 27-2 combined record of these next 4 opponents over these next 5 games. So I don't expect ASU to stay undefeated for too long, but I think as long as they're not coming back from this stretch, 7-5. They play some competitive baseball. I think they're good enough and have a deep enough lineup and some added depth, in the pitching staff to make things interesting against some of these SEC Titans there. 4 ranked opponents. It's going to be tough, but then it's probably when you're getting into the swing of things in the Big 12 play, you're not going to be necessarily going in, week out with opponents of this caliber. So it'd be good measuring stick early on for Willie Bloomquist and his new look Devils. All right, Joe, main event time. Let's get our hater on right now. We are going to discuss what we feel are the rankings of these budding rivalries. Now, as you mentioned, there's going to be no suspense as to who number 1 is. But, we have not consulted each other on our lists, and we each have respective different tiers because not all hate is created equal. So, Joe, why don't you start things off with your bottom tier on the budding rivalry rankings?
Yeah, and just to reiterate, so you're going to hear kind of different concepts from Brad and me. This is not like a 1-for-1 deal like we've done a lot in the past. We're like, all right, who's your number 5? Who's your number 5? Who's your top guy? So we're going to have some similarities, some differences. Again, we didn't compare notes, so we're hearing this for the first time. So yeah, I have split these into 5 groups essentially, and kind of different levels of where I think these opposing teams are relative to like a possible rivalry with Arizona State. So my bottom tier, my lowest tier, they share the common denominator of geography in the sense that these are the schools that I would imagine are technically like farthest away from ASU. And I think that's a bit of a hindrance. When they're on the totally other side of the country, you're not always like competing for recruits. You may not have a ton of history or have played much in the past. In some cases, there are some previous meetings. So these are ones that just, to me, like it feels like it would take quite a bit for there to be a legitimate rivalry or even like a secondary or tertiary, to use a college word, rivalry. And so that's going to be the trio of Cincinnati, UCF, and West Virginia. Now, obviously, ASU's played these teams, and in the case of Cincinnati, you actually got a couple of transfers from them. Justin Watley and technically Shimon Matera came from Colorado, but never played there. UCF, West Virginia. You got the Rich Rod thing with West Virginia. Heck, you got the Scott Frost thing with UCF, and there's some history there with ASU. But I think, again, geography with those schools just kind of puts them in a different category because just when you have a difference like some of the ones that are in Utah or even Texas, that makes a difference to me. So that's why I put those 3 in no particular order, lumped at the bottom of my list.
My first tier, Joe has 5 tiers. I have 4 tiers. This one's kind of just I've called it the we'll see. Comprises 6 teams overall. Some similar names. All 3 of yours are in this tier. And if I were to kind of count backwards with, starting with my 15 UCF, I think that there's, some similarities there. The game that ASU played, that didn't necessarily have the highest stakes. I don't think UCF's in danger of becoming a real player in the conference anytime soon. I think there's also some kinship there. Some sunny locations, school with a hearty party reputation, we'll say, that maybe has some geared towards some space exploration elements. At 14, I have West Virginia. I think mainly just they kind of get the edge up there just because of the Rich Rod thing. But even then, that's kind of, on its last legs a little bit. We'll see what he can do up there. Those retread hires really don't often pay off, but, we'll see what kind of juice there. I have Kansas number 13. I think that they are there right now. I think that we'll see if this recent success they've had in seasons can make some of the future games against ASU a little bit more impactful, a little more important. Of course, they'll be meeting up over the pond here in a couple months. Cincinnati 12. They're, I think, one of those teams like every year starts off pretty decent. Handed ASU a loss, in Cincinnati, and it was like 8 a.m., 9 a.m. body clock time for the Devils at that point, but they always tail off at the end. Oklahoma State, I have at 11. There was that 3-year stretch, before ASU jumped in where they played them each and every year, but they're going to be a rebuilding program. Mike Gundy's gone, so this is going to be kind of a fresh, clean slate situation. I think kind of a similar note for my last team in the we'll see tier. Kansas State, usually a pretty good team, pretty solid, but we'll see exactly as they kind of turn over a new leaf in their program's history if they're going to be able to sustain that. And of course, the ASU K-State game from a couple of years ago had some stakes to it. So I think of that group, I'm leaning more towards K-State having some of the most juice in the future, just because of their historical caliber of decent or decent adjacent play.
Okay, so as we progress through things, again, not knowing what each of us picked, there are going to be some similarities, some slight differences, but we're kind of staying on the same track here. So my next tier up, and again, this is just going to be all lumped together. There'll be some future tiers here that I will rank within it, but this one, again, they're just all kind of lumped together. And this is the group where I could see something developing. Really isn't too much spark there right now. It would probably take something relatively significant, like some controversial ending or a big transfer or recruiting episode to happen. Just basically some event that really ignites a rivalry. But I think the odds are a little bit greater for this group than the previous one. And I'm just going in alphabetical order here. Baylor is my first one there. And that's one, again, there was a tense game out there in Waco this fall, really memorable win for ASU. So again, there's some measures where this, could create into something. Kansas, they had the one game in Tempe in 2024. Obviously, there's some near decade ago basketball history between these programs, though not really materializing the same now that they're in the same basketball conference. But again, one where it's like there just really isn't too much there, but there could be something. The third one for me and the last one on this tier of the list is Oklahoma State. So it's Baylor, Kansas, Oklahoma State. So again, there could be some things there, but when I just look at them objectively, there's nothing about these teams that really stands out as far as anything that is any current material that could, be a rivalry inducing type of thing. And the path to get there takes some twists and turns, as you'll see. There's another tier where it's a little bit more viable to me. So again, these are ones that it could turn around and stuff can jump off in a heartbeat. I mean, we've had some opposing teams where it's like, all right, I like them and their fans, but then this one game or this one event happened and this series of reactions occurred, and now I think totally different of them. We have seen this stuff on social media where you can take a left turn in a hurry, but for now, they're a little bit further down the list.
All right, so my second tier comprising teams 7, 8, 9 on my rivalry ranking list. I'm calling this the Battle of Texas. I have Houston 9, Baylor 8, TCU 7, and I think for the name of the tier says it all. These are teams that are obviously in the Lone Star State, a state that Arizona State has made a huge priority and has been such a crucial component to the Sun Devils' success under Kenny Dillingham, Brian Carrington, and his recruiting ties as well. So much of this roster for the Sun Devils, is from the state of Texas, and these are three teams that I think are kind of at least in similar, maybe perhaps states. Maybe overall just kind of perception in the recruiting battles. I think that this team's going to be facing. I think this is going to be a situation where you have games can be, this is a reason ASU has scheduled so many non-conference games in the state of Texas. And when they have these future trips, of course you mentioned the thrilling game against Baylor last season, the trip to TCU next season, I believe in 27, Houston, I think is also on that 27 list as well. Which will then cap off ASU being and visiting every program in the conference. But these three teams, I think, are a similar stature to the Sun Devils in some ways historically. All three, are pretty significant powers in other sports in which ASU is looking to be ascendant is in as well. But I think on a football capacity, you've seen some really thrilling games so far in some limited opportunities. Since ASU has joined the conference. So I think, these games, in addition to being crucial for the win-loss record and the conference standings. I think you're also going to be, having some added juice in terms of just, having ASU continue their upward trend as being a serious player in the state of Texas.
All right, so my next group, this is where I'm going to start numbering things, because I think those first two, it's just a little too much, like not enough there to where it can't really put together a true pecking order in my eyes. That's why we're having some fun with this. So this is the group where they're not yet there, but I could feel like they're, to an extent, maybe on the doorstep or just near the driveway in the neighborhood of possible rivalry type of situations. So at the bottom of this list, my numbers are off on where we would be. Let's see, 10, something like that. All right, overall, doing some quick math. But the bottom one on this list is going to be Kansas State. This is a team that they're a historically, proud team. They've had some high level successes. They've been viewed kind of as like that underdog Cinderella. I remember those Bill Snyder Kansas State teams, even from like the late 90s when they're playing the Fiesta Bowl, right? Like Michael Bishop days. I remember that being a team that had a lot of that underdog type of thing to it. Or, you move forward when they used to play them in the Holiday Bowl with like L. Roberson and Terrence Newman and Darren Sproles, of course. Those are throwback names for you. So I could see a program that, has had that sort of underdog Cinderella type of designation applied to it. Maybe taking offense to another team that kind of fits in that role. And that's obviously what ASU was in 2024 and the meteoric rise that it had to the Big 12 title and the college football playoff. So it could kind of be like a little territorialism there. So that's one. But again, there isn't too much substance. There's been that one game, which was a great win for ASU on the road. So that one, again, it takes some work, but I could see something developing there. Now, next on this list for me, and it's kind of a similar narrative with Kansas State, and that's Houston. Houston is an up-and-coming team. Houston is a team that has been recruiting well. Coming up this year, they're going to have that 5-star true freshman quarterback there with the club. Now, obviously, ASU recruits the Houston area, and Texas as a whole, but a lot of recruiting in Houston, both for high school prospects. They do junior college, recruiting there, and a lot of transfers that whether they come from Texas schools at the collegiate level, they are Texans. So that still is a factor there. So I can see some of those battles happening. And let's not forget that football game in Tempe against Houston, if y'all remember when we did our season-ending awards, for me, I picked that as like the most disappointing loss or the worst loss, whatever, we use for that particular category. I mean, that was kind of an ugly game. Obviously, a lot of players got hurt for ASU. So that kind of game plays itself, I think, into a near rivalry situation. And then the top of the list in this tier for me is going to be TCU. ASU, again, as I mentioned, they recruit the Houston area a lot. They certainly recruit the Dallas-Fort Worth area a lot as well. So that's a factor there. You want to get some wins there. TCU, again, of course, a team that's had some very high-level success. It wasn't that long ago they were in the national championship game. They played in, the multitude of Fiesta Bowls and that sort of thing. So there is some success there. But so that's a team that I think is generally on par with where ASU is. And so I think when you have teams that are kind of jockeying for a similar position within the conference, then that can kind of get a little gritty thing going on. So, and I'd kind of like to see it. I was born in Dallas. I love Fort Worth. So I guess I'm kind of iffy about it because I don't want to like hate TCU because I love Fort Worth, Texas. So I kind of want it to be like a kind rivalry, if that's a thing. I don't know if that is a thing. So I'm kind of hoping it into existence in the right way.
All right, my penultimate tier is a 2-team tier. First up, coming in number 6 overall, Colorado. Even when we were in the Pac-12 with the Buffaloes, that's not a rivalry or a series that I ever felt had a tremendous amount of juice. Now, of course, over time there was some really good games, like a couple that perhaps had some stakes to them a little bit, but for the most part, ASU had their way with there. Now, of course, with Deion Sanders taking over the program a couple of years ago, that elevated the profile of the Buffalo program. And of course, the win in Tempe, Shador flashing the watch gesture, whatever it's called at the time, whatever. Of course, that was kind of the redshirt year for the Sun Devil program, with being so racked by injuries. ASU, of course, ran all over them this past season a little bit to get some measure of revenge there. I think just they get some goodwill because they were on the schedule every year as a Pac-12 South member, but now that it's going to be a little bit irregular in terms of the rotation, I think it loses some of that luster. But they get in the recent history tier because just because of those games, and we'll see if Colorado can in the post Dion era, or if maybe Dion can salvage the nosedive that the program is currently experiencing. Maybe they can make things a little bit more interesting. And number 5 overall, rounding out the recent history tier, Iowa State. Of course, the Big 12 title game was a big major factor there. That was a terrific football game. And then the Jeff Sims show this past season in Ames, Iowa. To really, there was a Iowa State program that came into the year with a lot of expectations coming off the trip to Arlington, and just they were kind of in a rough spot. ASU, I think, really kind of nailed, put the final nail in that's their 2025 season coffin there a little bit. So I always also have kind of drawn some parallels between ASU and Iowa State over the years, and I do think that they might have had a chance to be a little bit higher for me, but of course with Matt Campbell moving on to Penn State, I think that losing your coach, losing your staff, and kind of having a program hit the reset button overall, and especially with the roster overhaul that they certainly have in the wake of Campbell's departure as well, that takes a little bit of speed off that fastball. But overall, I think the Iowa State ASU games in the future are going to have some good juice to them as well, because of all the recent games with some stakes in there as well. And I think that they're two solid programs that are probably going to be at worst kind of on the periphery of the contender status in the conference.
All right, so my next to last tier, I'm actually going to make an on-the-fly change. It's going to be a 2-team tier, and kind of similar stuff. These are going to be teams, like the theme of this tier is teams that were in the Big 12 prior to ASU's arrival, and there's already been some stuff that's happened that you could realistically say that, okay, we're either kind of in that rivalry mode or maybe one game away from it. Definite step up from the other teams that we've talked about. So number 6 for me, picking up where you left off, is going to be Iowa State. ASU, it's kind of interesting that of the teams that were in the Big 12 prior to ASU's arrival, Texas Tech and Iowa State are the only two teams that ASU has played both years, in 2024 and 2025. So you've got more repetition between these two teams than you have with others like the TCUs and the Houstons and the UCFs of the world, that sort of thing. I would imagine that the Iowa State fan base is not too thrilled that ASU beat them in the Big 12 championship game in 2024. I would imagine that they weren't too thrilled that ASU went into their house and with their backup quarterback put up a record-setting day and took down the Cyclones in a season that for them was not what they expected to be, but it was still a pretty good one, and still had some momentum at that point before ASU came in there. Now then, like you mentioned, I think it is a substantial thing with Matt Campbell leaving. You look at, what he did at that program and the superhuman things by typical program standards and the things that he achieved that nobody before him ever did in program history. So I'm really curious what Iowa State football is going to look like from this point forward. Obviously, they lost not only the coach, but a ton of transfers to Penn State and elsewhere. So major rebuild there. So we'll see what that does with this, because if that, unfortunately, and it would be unfortunate if it happens to take the Iowa State program back to like its previous level, then it's not much of a rivalry if the team isn't really getting the bowl eligibility too often. So moving up to number 5, and the second of two teams on this list is going to be Texas Tech. Now, naturally, this is one that I think you could bump into that upper category. You just need a little bit more repetition if you're taking it on like a full athletic department thing. Now, of course, the basketball victory that ASU's men's team had not too long ago kind of chips into that. Also curious to see this pick in Iowa State are polar opposite ends of the spectrum, because, I'm personally very concerned if Iowa State is going to be able to keep anything near what Campbell did. Now then, talking about another Campbell, oddly enough, very closely involved with the Texas Tech program. And when you can pretty much cut a blank check every single year, even though they got skunked in the college football playoff, and even though ASU took them down and it wasn't like a full squad for ASU there, and you got guys like Jordan Tyson getting hurt during the game, this is still a program that is very likely going to have a lot of power moving forward. And so we'll see, what ASU can do to compete with that. But so far, that is, really become something of the oddness of the fact that the regular season football game winner or the loser rather, went on to win the Big 12 championship. So I don't know. Do you want to lose this game every year if that trend continues? Maybe. I don't know. But definitely, as far as, with one exception, as we'll be told in a moment, as it pertains to all the other Big 12 teams that didn't come from the Pac-12, Texas Tech is one that has really shown itself as a possible, rivalry. These are two programs that, before they got their massive influx of NIL funding, a lot of similarities between Texas Tech and Arizona State, and still you could say so, historically, just as far as what they've done, what they haven't done. So Iowa State, Texas Tech, there's already something there.
All right, so one tier left for me. We've gone through the We'll See, Battle of Texas, and recent history tiers. Now it's time to close things out with the heated. And of course, I have been very vocal and adamant over since 2011. Probably, when did I start this theory? Like 2014 or 15, maybe.
I think it was like
that
when Utah started to be decent, because they had the first few years they weren't really good at all, and it felt like it was like a bad move for them to move up. But then 2015 is when they had that really good year, so that could have been it.
Yeah, it sounds about right. Yeah, those first couple years with John Hayes or whoever their quarterback was, and the Wilson guy in 14 or something. But yeah, so once ASU and Utah started to get some big time games, I was adamant that after U of A, of course, that Utah had now jumped into that number 2 rival spot. I no longer have those feelings. They are number 4 on my heated list. Big part of this is because of the uncertainty of the post Kyle Whittingham era. He's now at Michigan, and he's in Ann Arbor, and took a lot of those good players. Now, there is the continuity of Morgan Scalley taking over as the longtime coach in waiting, and I don't think that necessarily a program with that kind of institutional foundation, even without its leader and figurehead for the last 20 some odd years, is going to fall apart overnight. But the history there is very intense. Racist dentists involved as well, and that whole thing. The games had stakes. The fan bases went after each other. I don't think in a nasty way outside of that dentist, but there were some weirdos in that fan base, and I think obviously if every fan base has them, but I think it was a good natured yet also intense rivalry, and of course ASU owned the series early. Then Utah got good, and I think near the last few years, Utah was really kind of in control of that series. We've seen them kind of back and forth now in each of the Big 12 years as well. So I think, this is going to be a game or a series that continues to be extremely heated. You have the Pac-12 rivalry years behind it. I believe, some of the even the WAC years before. But I think this is going to be a situation where, even though that they might not necessarily be on the schedule each and every year as a Pac-12 South opponent, it's still going to be a very bitter rivalry. But in the last couple of years, I think that BYU, and granted, ASU's only played them once, but I think the fallout from that game is so fascinating to me, to see how these fan bases kind of interacted. Of course, BYU's always had a big following in the Valley, and I remember in that game there was a big quadrant of blue in the corner of Mountain America Stadium, and then you saw the game transpire in the fashion that it did, and a game that ended twice. And then you saw the fallout, which you're still seeing some social media chatter whenever ASU and BYU go at it in other sports or something, that they're still very mad that Kenny Dillingham has emotions and was fired up after that game. And so it's good to see that BYU has now become a really solid annual contender in the Big 12 conference. Kalani Sitake, as long as he's there, I think he should get those guys in a great position. They have the Crumble cookie money behind him now, so they should have a good roster year in and year out, but not nearly as good as the number 2 team behind Arizona on my rivalry rankings. I have Texas Tech. Joe, that fan base is full of weirdos. The Sam Levitt stuff this year was so weird. Just flooding social media, asking for feet pics. This was such a new money kind of mentality that this program had of, they were solid at times throughout their history, usually not a serious program contender, but now that they got the infusion of cash, it paid off for them. Obviously, making a run to the college football playoff. And of course, their first meeting is with ASU as a Big 12 member. They got the Red Raiders got the win in Lubbock, but ASU, of course, scored the huge upset, the only regular season loss for Texas Tech over the course of the season. Just a couple weeks ago, ASU basketball took down, I believe, number 13 at the time, Texas Tech here in Tempe. And but mainly the vibes of that fan base. You touched on it earlier. Like, I think that first year, it was like, okay, these guys are pretty cool. They kind of had a similar trajectory of a program that's trying to find its footing and find some sustained success rather than just like being good every 5-10 years. But man, there's something that happened overnight once they got that Cody Campbell money, and once they really decided to unload on that roster and have this, it seemed like the seeming element that everything is to be handed to them, that they have of like this, like they bought blue blood status. It just rubs me the wrong way. I know it rubs a lot of ASU fans the wrong way. The Sam Levitt stuff again was really weird and creepy during the week leading up to that game, and they've been making excuses on social ever since. So whenever I see like a Twitter handle with the little cactus emoji, and I'm like, no, mute. Other than our good friend of the show, Joe Lopez,
Of course.
He's a good dude. But yeah, so Texas Tech, congratulations! You also bought your way to number 2 on my budding rivalry list, behind, of course, Arizona.
So for me, it's down to 4, and I guess now that I think of it, it's a bit of a spoiler alert, but you can kind of call it like the 4 corners grouping, something like that. So starting with number 4, for me is going to be Colorado. And this is one that from 2011, when they joined the Pac-12, up through the 2022 season, they probably would have been dead last on the list. This team had nothing with ASU. They had nothing going at all. But when Deion Sanders was hired, and, man, that obviously changed a lot there. And especially in that first year, there was a lot of hype. There were a lot of folks that were John at Sun Devil fans that game. I saw it and I experienced it. Social media is just unreal. And you talked about kind of like seeing the cactus emoji and giving that something. When I see Colorado fans, or when they're chirping at me on social media, I look at their bios, and without fail, it's always like Colorado and the Cowboys and the Lakers and the Yankees and the Dodgers. Like, all right, I kind of see where we're coming from here. So that, and again, that 2023 game where they won in the last minute, and you talked about the arrogance and the cockiness of Shedeur Sanders and what that did. Now, obviously, they didn't play in 2024, and that would have been fun because, that was a talented Colorado team, though I contend that winning 9 games and finishing, I believe, 4th in the conference is a disappointing outcome for that team. If you have the Heisman Trophy winner and the guy who won the conference offensive player of the year, you should be able to get in the double digits. That, to me, I don't care. That's a disappointing season. Folks want to argue with me on that. They've done it for quite a while. Keep it coming. So there is some fire there. Now then, the Colorado program, at least based on what we saw last year, had a very quick ascent and a pretty quick fall back down to earth because the 2025 season was not kind for them. I personally wonder just how much of the Deion Sanders experiment is actually going to last in Boulder, but there is some fire there. And again, the social media aspect of it, because that's where we really see the most of it. You just see these games once a year, if that in some cases, but you get on a regular basis some social media interaction. And just I don't know if there are folks, if they have an army of people that just have notifications set up for when certain names are mentioned, because if you talk anything about a Sanders, you're going to hear about it. For me, it's kind of fun. But that's what puts them number 4. It would be higher if they had a better program, but they do not. So coming up, number 3 for me is going to be Utah. I was never a massive proponent on the rivalry with them, but I could totally understand that there was something. And it's really, really interesting. I've never been to Salt Lake, never been to a game there, but I've heard almost invariably from ASU fans that I trust that like the online social media experience with a lot of Utah fans is different than the in-person experience. But I think the presence of like BYU maybe like deflected a lot of that away from ASU, because Utah has like its legitimate hated rival in the same conference now. So I don't think that they're as preoccupied with ASU, because back before in the old Pac-12 days, there was a lot between the populations and the cities and stuff like that. So that had a lot of juice to it. It's still a solid program, really eager to see what happens with the coaching change, but they've got a lot of talent. There's a high standard there. So you figure that things are going to stay at least at a decently high level. I don't envision Utah falling completely off the map. We got the nice little thing. We got our good brother Patrick Kinahan, ASU alum, who joins us every year when we're talking about the youth. So that adds a little something to it because he likes to have fun as well. All right, so that takes us to the top two. Obviously, we know what number one is. We're not making any crazy claims that something else is, leapfrog in Arizona in the rivalry thing. For me, number two is BYU. And that took some thought because I'm like, man, like they really have only played once, at least in the Big 12 era. But I think back to like my childhood, and I grew up in Mesa, Arizona. And if you know anything about the demographic population of Mesa, Arizona, there's a very, very high LDS contingent there. A lot of great friends of mine, great people. When I was growing up and I saw, kids, my contemporaries, and they're wearing like college football t-shirts or sweaters or something like that, it was ASU, it was U of A, it was BYU. Like those are the three that you saw. So I kind of grew up in it a little bit, even though, of course, in the state of Arizona. And fast forward, you get them back in the same conference for the first time in decades since they were in the WAC. And that first meeting, I mean, that did not disappoint in any way, shape, or form, both just from the athletic theater of it, but also this prospective rivalry thing about it. And as you mentioned, Brad, there was such a ridiculous fallout social media wise, and everybody, a great deal of BYU fans trying to make some comments about Kenny Dillingham and his interactions with the referees during the review, and just even any slight thing that they could find there. So there's already a great deal of substance there. I think just the typical ASU fan and the typical BYU fan, at least what you would stereotype them to be, what these schools are known for, very, very different. So it's kind of almost like the Catholics and convicts thing of the Notre Dame, Miami of, decades ago. It's got a little bit of that to it. So I think just them being on polar opposite ends of the spectrum in many regards can really make for a heated rivalry. Of course, these two teams did meet this past year on the gridiron. We'll be back, in the state of Utah in 2026 this fall coming up. So we'll see how that goes. Obviously, that program is on very, very stable ground with Sataki there and just what they've been able to do. So the game should continue to have very high stakes. But man, that game in 2024 in Tempe just had the vibe, had the feel of like, all right, like I know this isn't just your everyday game because there's a huge atmosphere and a lot on the line, but it felt like there was so much more personal than that was at stake that afternoon in Mountain America Stadium. Obviously, number one is U of A, but I personally feel like I can endorse BYU as a secondary rival, whereas I wasn't quite as willing to do that in years past with Utah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thankfully, Kenny Dillingham wasn't arrested as some of the BYU fans were calling for after that game for how meanly he talked to that poor referee and how he must have been on drugs in order to yell in that way. And but yeah, so there's a lot of good hate going on here, good sports hate in the Big 12, some half-baked hate that maybe needs some more time in the oven, and some that's maybe perhaps hate that's not ready for prime time. It'd be interesting. Maybe we should do this again like next February after this upcoming season and some of these teams get a second go around. ASU, of course, yeah, you mentioned heading up to Provo. The third straight year also that ASU is playing Texas Tech. That's kind of weird. It seems like, at most you might get two, but every year now ASU is going to be playing Tech, but some of these other teams are going to get a second go around. So I think it should be a fun year, and I think our rankings are probably going to tweak a little bit, at this time next year.
Yeah, because they're like you're saying with Texas Tech, a lot came out of the woodworks over the course of the season. So there could be, a fan base that we aren't even really thinking about right now that could, poke up and be something that really changes the game in this rivalry aspect. And that's what you get when you're dealing with a 16-team conference that crosses a great portion of the country. A lot of teams, of course, never were in conferences before. There were several on this list that prior to joining the Big 12 ASU had never even played before or hadn't played in decades. So just, of course, even though we're more than the midway point through year two, there's still a lot that feels new about this whole thing.
Yeah, maybe some weird stuff will happen in the bounce house this upcoming season. UCF becomes the new number 2 or something. Some weird battle for space supremacy or something. But I think that's going to do it for this episode of Speak of the Devils. We'll post our full list on social media that you can really break down in our tiers as well. You can find that on Instagram at Speak of the Devils, on Twitter at SOTD Podcast. Subscribe on YouTube. follow on Facebook and give me a follow on all things social media at bdenny29.
And you can follow me at Joe Healey42. And as always, huge shout out. Thank you to our sponsors. We strongly encourage that you give all these businesses your business. Burrito Express, Cactus Sports, DevilsDigest.com, Jones Auto Group, Nice Pest Company, Sun Devil Family Charities, and More Lending, LLC branch, NMLS number 2732146, PJ Saturno, NMLS number 257912.
Once you're done supporting all of our amazing sponsors, drop us a 5-star review on the podcast platform of your choice. Joe and I will be back next week for some more Sun Devil fun as spring practice draws near.